lecture in the 2015 Science Lecture Series. The Science of Food and Health is our topic this year. I'm Cindy Larive. I'm a professor of chemistry and a CNAS divisional dean. I'd like to let you know that the 2015 Science Lecture Series has been co-sponsored by CNAS, but also by the University of California Global Food Initiative and the California Agriculture and Food Enterprise, CAFE, which is a new institute at UCR that we're very excited about. The prior presentations from this series, both video and PowerPoint, are available on the CNAS Science Lecture Series webpage, and they can be accessed from the URL that's listed in your program. So in case you weren't able to join us for the earlier presentations, we hope that you'll take the time to look at them online. They were also quite interesting. This evening's presentation will be added probably next week. I'd like to acknowledge our CNAS Science Ambassadors. They're serving as ushers tonight. You'll recognize them by their blue polo shirts. They're standing in the back of the room. These are really the top students in our college. We're very proud of them, and they assist the college in many ways. Tonight's lecture features Dr. Ilhem Messaoudi Powers. She is a faculty member in the Department of Biomedical Sciences and UCR's medical school. We're very proud of our new medical school, which is now completing its second year. As you'll learn from her presentation, there are many synergies between CNAS and the School of Medicine and exciting research opportunities at the intersection between basic science and translational research. Dr. Messaoudi Powers is an immunologist whose research focuses on three general areas. These are the impact of age on the immune response to viral infections, modulation of immune function by nutritional intake and sex steroids, and uncovering mechanisms of pathogenesis during infection with emerging and re-emerging infectious agents. Her presentation this evening will address the interplay between diet and our immune system. So with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Dr. Messaoudi Powers.
I'd like to thank Cindy for such a lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming today. And I'm really looking forward to my talk. I try to structure it in such a way to leave plenty of time at the end for questions that I'm expecting to have lots of them, right? So I'm going to use my mouse to point things because of the dual screen, so bear with me if things don't show up right away. And the overview of my presentation today is going to be as followed. We're going to start by first giving you an introduction to the immune system, because we can't talk about immunity if we don't know what the different players that are part of our immune system are. And then I'm going to talk about the impact of obesity or overnutrition on immunity. And then I'm going to talk about some new exciting area of research in my lab as well as across the country, which is looking at the transgenerational effect of obesity. So we're going to talk a little bit about what maternal obesity during pregnancy, how does it impact the immune system actually of the offspring. And then we'll touch briefly on malnutrition. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about so malnutrition and caloric restriction, then the microbiome, and our micronutrients. So we're going to try and cover a lot of topics today, and I hope that I'm not overwhelming the presentation. So to start off, every day we are under attack. That's what I'd like to say. We're under attack by multiple microbes. We're actually come into contact with multiple kinds of microbes every single day. And these could be bacteria, they could be parasites like worms, they could be viruses like the influenza virus, or they could be fungi like yeast. And within us as well, we face the threat of cells becoming cancerous. And for the most part, we don't even know that we've been under attack from these microbes on a daily basis. We feel fine, we go on with our lives, and that's because we have this wonderful system called the immune system. And really, as far as I'm concerned, the immune system is the Avengers. And just like the Avengers, there's multiple kinds of immune cells, and each one of them has a special power, and they're pretty kick-ass by themselves, but together they're completely unstoppable. And that's what I'm hoping to convince you of by the end of my lecture today. So, what is our immune system composed of? Overall, we can divide the immune system into two parts. Part one is called the innate immune system. And this is actually an ancient form of immunity that we share with plants and invertebrates. So even your citrus tree in your background and your backyard and your avocado tree actually has an innate immune system because they too face microbial challenges every single day. And so innate immunity can be broadly categorized into these various compartments. So the first layer of protection is actually our epithelial barriers. And that is our skin, mucus, cilia in our trachea that beat and help us remove things that come into contact with our airways, saliva, tears. All of these act as barriers to repel microbes. And they're very effective. So not only are they a physical barrier in some cases, in other cases they actually have antimicrobial peptides in them. So there's a lot of these, almost think of them as our own body's antibiotics against microbes that are made in saliva and tears. And they do a really pretty good job of keeping us safe. As a second line of defense, we have these cells called the phagocytes. And as the name implies, they like to eat up. They're like the Pac-Man of the immune system. They like to gobble up microbes and destroy them. And they're really, really good about grabbing most microbes and destroying them within the actual phagocyte in a way that's contained so it doesn't cause a lot of damage to other neighboring cells that might not be infected. And they do a pretty good job of attacking those microbes that make it past that first layer of barrier and get into our bodies. There's another specialized kind of phagocytic cell called the dendritic cell. And these guys can also ingest microbes, but they have a special power, which is that after ingesting a microbe, they can actually put small parts of it up here, like where my arrow is. Think of these as like flags, and we'll talk about the importance of these bits of microbes that they put on their cell surface in the next slide. So remember that. And then there's this other awesome cell called the natural killer cells. And they are really good at killing unhealthy cells. And unhealthy cells could be cells that have become cancerous. It could be cells that are infected with a virus or a bacteria. And these natural killer cells can recognize a cell that's not quite normal. They don't know necessarily why it's not quite normal, but they can tell that it's not quite normal. And they're really good at killing it. And again, it's just very precise, like the snipers. They go in, they take out that one cell, no damage to the neighboring cells, and move on. And then finally, we have a lot of proteins in our plasma. So these are proteins that are in circulation all the time. And there's multiple different kinds of proteins. They could be cytokines, chemokines, complement proteins. And think of these proteins as the way that the immune system communicates with each other and with the other cells in the body. So chemokines, for example, are actually little beacons that certain cells produce to attract other immune cells to come and help it. So let's say one of these phagocytes encounters a bacteria, and it sends out these chemokines to tell other phagocytic cells to come over and help it digest the bacteria. And so it's how the immune system regulates itself and also communicates with other cells in the body. So the second part of the immune system is called the adaptive immunity. And this type of immunity is only present in vertebrates. It's primarily made of B cells and T cells, but do not let the small number of cells, the adaptive immune system, fool you, because these guys are like the SEALs of the immune system. They are few, but they are lethal. And B cells are known for their ability to make antibodies. And I'm sure you've heard, if you've gone to your physician, they try to take a titer. So that's what they're measuring. They're actually measuring how many antibodies you have in circulation against something. So that's what a titer is. I'm sure many of the UCR students, when you first got here, you went to student health and they took your blood and measured a whole bunch of titers and then told you what vaccines to go get if you have not done that already. So that's what they're measuring. They're measuring antibodies. These antibodies are very long-lived. Once B cells see a microbe, they make lots of antibodies against it. Those antibodies have a very long half-life, and those B cells are basically there forever. They remember that particular microbe, and they'll keep making really good antibodies for the rest of your life. So that's the basis of vaccination for us, right? This is why we give ourselves vaccines. We make these antibodies and these great B cells that will remember that particular microbe for the rest of our life. Our T cells can be divided into two subsets. We have the CD4 helper T cells, and they're really important helper cells. They help everyone in the immune system. They actually help things that are part of the innate immune system. So they help those phagocytic cells function better. They help B cells make antibodies, and they'll help CD8 T cells, which we'll talk about in a second, also perform their job. So because we're in the NBA playoffs, think of these guys as the point guards. They pass the ball to everyone. They're coordinating everything. And then the CD8 T cells are like the natural killer cells. They're also killer cells. They primarily are responsible for clearing viral infected cells and cells that are infected with intracellular bacteria, like Listeria, which causes food poisoning. And the adaptive immune cells, just like innate immune cells, also make tons of cytokines and chemokines to communicate with each other and communicate with the innate immune system. So this is a really complex network of cells and molecules. And I know I just threw a huge alphabet soup at you, but hopefully by the end of the lecture, it'll all make sense. So these two parts really do come together and work in a very tightly regulated manner to respond to a microbial infection. There is a list of events that have to happen in a very specific sequence for a good immune response to take place. And players cannot come ahead of their role or after when it's too late. They really have to play specific roles at specific times. So let's imagine in this case that we have this, we like to call microbes pathogens as well. So I'll use those two words interchangeably throughout my talk. But let's think of the scenario where a microbe has actually managed to breach the skin, which was your first barrier of defense. You had a cut and you walked on a piece of glass that was contaminated with a bacteria. So that's kind of the scenario you think. Or we have some sort of breach and an influenza virus has gotten into now our respiratory system. The first line of defense will be that the skin cells will make some antimicrobial peptides and try to kill that bacteria. If that doesn't work, then these phagocytic cells come into play, and they'll try to eat this bacteria. And in the process of killing that bacteria, they'll also make some chemokines and recruit some other phagocytic cells, like these neutrophils. And they'll also recruit some dendritic cells. If this bacterial infection or this virus infection is not contained, those dendritic cells now will travel to one specific area of our body called the lymph node. And they will, remember those little bits I told you about, little pathogens that they put up on their cell surface? So this is where they come into play. They use that to tell the T cells that there is actually a microbe. That's the only way a T cell can actually be told that there is an infection that they need to go do something about. And you really want this to be very tightly regulated. T cells by themselves cannot go over and find an infected cell all by themselves and kill it. They need to be specifically instructed by the dendritic cells. Otherwise, nothing happens. And that's really important because you don't want, like I said, T and B cells, they're fewer cells, but they're very lethal. So you don't want them running rogue in your body. You want them to be instructed as to what the infection is and where they need to go. Once a T cell is activated by this process, it will either, if it's a CD4 T cell, it will go and help some B cells to make some antibodies, or they themselves might differentiate into some killer cells and go take care of the infection. So you could see that this has to happen in a very tightly coordinated manner. And usually, 99% of the time, the infection is resolved and we go on and have a normal, healthy life afterwards. So our immune system is actually very fragile, and it's under the influence of so many things that we come into contact with on a daily basis. It's influenced by our age. It's influenced by environmental pollutants and toxins that we come into contact with. It's influenced by our food, by what we drink, by viruses and other bacteria that might be living within us. And believe it or not, we actually carry a lot of viruses with us at all times. And by our DNA, our genetic material, and by hormones. And my lab studies multiple aspects of this complex interaction between the immune system and our environment in general. So I'd like to start off by talking about overnutrition and the immune system. And a large body of work that has been accumulating over the last couple of decades has very clearly demonstrated that both malnutrition or starvation as well as overnutrition are very, very bad for the immune system and result in a increased incidence, susceptibility, vulnerability. We're more prone to getting infections if we're either malnourished or we're overnourished. And for very different mechanisms that we will go over in the next few slides. So even though you have you have overnutrition and undernutrition, the result is that there is more infections. And so to start off with the concept of obesity or overnutrition, I think everyone here in this room has probably seen these slides one too many times, but over the last 50 years, the rates of obesity in the United States have skyrocketed. And this is actually true not just in the United States, but everywhere. And obesity is defined usually using what we call the body mass index. And it's a combination of your height and your weight. Of course, if you're a super athlete or a linebacker, don't even bother about the BMI. Doesn't mean anything. But for most of us, the average person, this is actually a pretty important number to know. And we define it as if you're between 20 and 25, it's considered healthy weight. 25 to 30 is overweight, and over 30 is obese. And over the last few years, we've seen a huge increase in the number of overweight and obese individuals in the United States. So 30% of the population is considered obese in the United States, and 67% of us are overweight at least. And we know that this is associated with multiple adverse health events. So hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer. And there was actually a paper that came out a couple years ago that showed that there was an inverse relationship between waist circumference and lifespan. So together, all these diseases are actually working to shorten our lifespan. But what about the immune system? We know that obesity is associated with an increased risk of infection. We see this was incredibly apparent during the H1N1 influenza outbreak. This was the first influenza outbreak in a long time where we actually saw young people in the intensive care unit. And when people dug in a little bit more, they found out that most of these young individuals were either pregnant women, and the immune system of a pregnant woman is very different because it actually has to tolerate a baby, so there's reasons for that. But the other category of people who were showing up in the ICU were people who were obese. And this was then shown also in animal models. So especially respiratory infections are very deadly if you're obese. Urinary tract infections, dental disease, periodontitis, hospital-acquired infections, and surgical complications are some of the leading causes of infections. And so you wonder, why is it that we're more at risk of developing secondary hospital-acquired infections if you're overweight or obese? And that's because there's dramatic changes in the immune system. So this is why it was so important for me to go over that alphabet soup earlier, so that when I say things like there is impaired skin barrier, you would know that if our skin is impaired, then microbes can get in a lot more easily. We know that there is actually a decreased frequency of T cells. So those cells that we said are very important for fighting infection, we actually have fewer numbers of them. And they can't migrate quite as well. So when they see those chemokines and those beacons being made, they can't quite make it to the site of infection as efficiently as they would in a lean person. And then the last bit of information is that not only are there fewer of these cells, but they tend to make a lot of those inflammatory cytokines. And while those inflammatory cytokines are really important in the acute phase, when you actually have a nail stuck to your finger, you're trying to get rid of all those microbes in there, chronic inflammation that persists for much longer than needed, is actually quite dangerous for us. And we know that it's associated with many things like increased incidence of cancer, of infection, of other health complications, pulmonary disease. And we know that individuals who are obese or overweight actually are at a higher risk of developing all these other diseases as well. So you can now start to appreciate that there is this very intricate interaction or conversation, dialogue between the immune system and the rest of our organ systems. And so it's really important that we maintain this relationship in a calm and cooperative manner and not an overinflamed state. So obesity is definitely bad for the person carrying the excess weight. But there is data, as I was saying earlier, that has now indicated that maternal obesity can have influence on the neonate or the offspring. And over here is a graph showing just the percent of women of childbearing age, and this was defined as in women between the ages of 20 and 45. I take offense at the 45 limit, but that's okay. Starts getting personal when you get to that age. But this is the percent of women of childbearing age who are obese. And it's divided by ethnicity. And you can see that we do have a big problem here. And we know that the risks to the mom are quite significant. So risks of preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, Difficulty with labor and delivery that would result in a C-section, for instance, dramatically increase with obesity. And I just told you 2 slides ago that the rates of getting a hospital-acquired infection or a surgical site complication is also higher with obesity. So you're increasing the chances of having to have surgery, and then you're at higher risk of getting a secondary infection while you're in the hospital. The risks to the baby are also not insignificant. There is an increased risk of birth defects, stillbirth. The chances of having extreme prematurity birth is also increased. These children will be at higher risk themselves of developing obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And there was actually recently a study that came out of Aberdeen, Scotland, that looked at 32,000 individuals. And because they have universal healthcare in Europe, they were able to go back and get the BMIs of the moms during their first prenatal visits. And then they looked at the incidence of cardiovascular disease in these 32,000 adults. And what they found was the biggest predictor of cardiovascular disease in this population was the mom's BMI. It wasn't actually the person's BMI. It wasn't what they were eating at that point. It was what their mom weighed at her first prenatal visit. And there was also a statistically significant decrease in lifespan in those individuals. And this was in Europe, where actually the number of moms who are obese in their data set was only 10%. So this is really important for us to keep in mind. And in terms of the immune system, actually, I'm really excited about this. We just published this paper a month ago, and it's always been my dream to be on some sort of NPR station, and I actually got interviewed by KPBS 2 days ago, and I was really excited. So we actually were able to show that maternal obesity during pregnancy, and so this is BMI at first prenatal visit. This is not excess weight gain during pregnancy, may actually compromise the immune system of the baby. So not only are we increasing the incidence of asthma and cardiovascular disease and everything else I said on my previous slide, we might be compromising the immune system. And so what I have here is the cells, the number of CD4 Tcells and CD8 Tcells in the cord blood collected from babies born to either lean, overweight, or obese moms. I remember what I said, the T cells are like the SEAL team of the immune system. And what you see here is there is actually a decrease in the number of T cells. This was statistically significant for CD4 T cells, which are the point guard of the immune system. So you're losing T cells that help coordinate very complex immune responses. You could see the same trend for CD8s, but it was not statistically significant in our study. In addition to that, when we looked at the ability of monocytes, so some of those phagocytic cells in the cord blood, looked at their ability to respond to bacteria, this was also decreased. So here what I have is one kind of bacteria. This is actually heat-killed listeria, which causes food poisoning. And this is LPS, which is a sugar that's found on a lot of different bacteria. Again, same thing. So these are the cord blood samples from babies born to lean, overweight, and obese moms. And you don't even need to know what IL-6 and TNF-alpha are. You can just see that there is a significant decrease in the production of those cytokines by cells that were collected from cord blood babies born to obese moms. And so together, these would actually, we would predict that they would put the babies at increased risk of infection and potentially not responding well to vaccinations during the first 2 years or 3 years of life until they can get their immune system back up to maturity. And this is one of the things that we're really following up on and trying to understand right now. So the other side of the coin, malnutrition. It's not something that we see a lot in the developed world, but in the developing world, there's actually 1 billion people that are undernourished in the world. And that's 20% of the world population, actually. And undernutrition is, of course, tightly regulated struggling with the mouse again, tightly regulated to an increase in mortality. And part of that is actually an increase in the rates of infections that we see, especially in children that are malnourished. We estimate that about 50% of children dying in developing worlds are actually due to malnutrition. And that's death due to infection. And so we know that there's a complex interaction in the developing world. So these children are at higher rate for childhood mortality because they can't get access to healthcare, they can't get to the hospital in time, they might not be a hospital for miles and miles. But we also know that there is a big impact on the immune system here. And this is sort of a laundry list of everything that has been shown in the literature to be affected with, especially with severe malnutrition. And what you can see from this complex list is that severe malnutrition affects both the innate as well as the adaptive part of our immune system. So, for example, things like even gastric acid production, we need that in our stomach to sort of repel microbes, production of flow of saliva. So every barrier of every function of the immune system, going from the actual barriers to T cell numbers, is decreased in these children, and that puts them at high risk of infection. So another thing that we always talk about, and it's coming to the summer, Memorial Day weekend, there's probably going to be a little bit of barbecuing, a little bit of drinking. So it's important that we talk about alcohol and the immune system. And just as I was mentioning with nutrition, alcohol use disorder, which is what we refer to when people drink too much, is very much associated with an increased incidence of infection. And this is particularly true for pneumonias, human immunodeficiency virus, and Hep C virus, hepatitis C virus. And at first, some of this data was a little controversial because they thought, well, it's because people who might be drinking a little too much might also be engaging in other illicit activities such as drugs, which might explain the increase in HIV and HCV. But since then, we've actually shown these data in animal models in the laboratory, where we know the mice are not running around trying to score on the corner of the street. So we know for sure that there is defects in the immune system that are predisposing us for a higher risk of infection. And further additional studies have shown that this is due to, this is becoming a regular theme in my talk, there's leaky barriers, so skin, mucus, our epithelial lining of the stomach, of the intestines, of the lungs is all leaky. And so microbes are no longer kept out of places that they should not be in. They can gain access a lot easier to our bodies. We have reduced phagocytic activity against those cells, are not able to ingest those bacteria fast enough. We have, again, reduced numbers of T and B cells and a reduced migration. So if you can't ingest the microbe and you can't call in help, and because there's not enough T cells and B cells to go around, it sets up the stage for a higher incidence of infection. But there's also some data that shows that moderate alcohol consumption is associated with a decreased incidence of colds. And this is in line with what this graph shows is actually all-cause mortality, so the risk for mortality, and then the number of drinks, and this is for a man. Not for a woman, I should make that clear. But you could see this, what we call a J-curve shape, where with moderate drinking, there's actually a reduction in all-cause mortality. And this is primarily driven actually by cardiovascular disease. We know that small amounts of alcohol are really good for your cardiovascular system. So it seems like maybe the immune system also has this J-curve effect. And so we really wanted to investigate this, and we did this in monkeys. And the reason why we did this study in monkeys is because, like humans, they actually have a natural tendency to drink alcohol. I love this picture. This is actually from a resort in the Caribbean, where you could see the orange juice and the beer. And clearly, we're making a choice that is not the orange juice. And so we use this monkey model because they naturally like to drink, like us, but and at the same time they have close genetic and physiological homology to our human systems. And this is a really complex slide, and I apologize. Let me walk you through it. So what we did, we had 12 monkeys in the study. 4 were controls, and 8 were allowed to drink. The 8 that were allowed to drink naturally segregated into 2 groups. 4 drank a lot, and 4 were very hip and only drank with their meals. About 0.04 all the time. The other ones were just luscious. They were like 0.1, 0.12. Yeah, we would not let them drive. Did not let them out of their cages. And what we did was we vaccinated them actually prior to the study, and then we came back 12 months later and vaccinated them again. And the first part of the graph here, find my mouse, shows the response to the first vaccine. And you could see that all 3 lines are just on top of one another. So there were no differences before these animals started drinking. Whoops. Oh. But after they started drinking, the black line is our controls, the blue are the monkeys that drank in moderation, and the red are the monkeys that drank to excess. And what you can see is that the blue line is bigger on top of the black line, and the red line is below. So excessive alcohol intake definitely was associated with a lower response. And these are T cells over here, and these are antibodies over here. It's a lot more clear when you look at antibody responses. So we were able to show in a controlled experimental setting in a laboratory that this was true. And this article came out right around Christmas last year. And you can only imagine the buzz that are created. I really don't wish to take this to say that we should all go drink to prevent colds from taking place. But so everything in moderation. And we actually went in and did a lot of gene expression analysis because we really wanted to know the mechanisms. Why was excessive alcohol intake so bad for the immune system? And why was moderate drinking boosting this immune response to vaccination? And what we found was actually big dramatic changes in the frequency and the types of genes that were made in these animals, whether they were controls or drank in moderation or drank to excess. And we actually were able to link a lot of those gene changes in the animals that drank to excess with suppression of protective immunity. So for example, all the genes that would encode for proteins that were important for recognizing microbes, for migration, all of those genes were suppressed. So in the immune cells of monkeys that drank to excess, they weren't able to make those proteins. Whereas the monkeys that drank in moderation actually made more of those proteins. But we also were able to link a lot of those changes to other diseases that we know occur with excessive alcohol consumption, such as chronic inflammatory lung disease and increased incidence of cancer. And when you drink too much, there's actually an increased incidence of cardiovascular disease. So I think the theme throughout is going to be everything in moderation in my talk today. So another critical component of our diet is micronutrients. And micronutrients are very important for the immune system because the immune system is metabolically very active, right? I just told you, when the immune system sees the microbes, they have to migrate to size, they have to multiply, they have to make cytokines and chemokines and complement, and they have to ingest microbes. And then they have to call in T cells, and then T cells have to migrate from far places and multiply and then contract. And there's a lot of action that happens. None of our organ systems go through that many changes, right? You don't hear about your liver migrating to your foot to do something and coming back and retracting and things like that. So our immune system is really special in that respect. And because of that, it needs a lot of antioxidant and trace elements to be able to continue to function properly. And we know that these micronutrients can act as I know there's a lot of technical jargon on the slide, and I apologize, but they're cofactors for enzymes that are involved in cell division and signal transduction, right? So I told you the immune system has to expand and contract and expand and contract. So these micronutrients are really important for those enzymes that help cells divide and then help cells contract. They also are important for making those cytokines and chemokines, so signal transduction. They're cofactors for transcription factors, so regulating how many genes you turn on and when you turn them on and when you turn them off. They are antioxidants, which are really important because those phagocytic cells that I was talking about, one of the ways by which they kill microbes inside of themselves is by actually causing reactive oxygen species. They basically oxidize the microbe. And so they need a lot of antioxidants to reverse the damage that they're doing to themselves by killing these microbes. And these small micronutrients can also act as epigenetic factors. I think that's a buzzword that probably a lot of you have heard, but that means that they regulate what genes we turn on and when we turn them on. And so I'm only going to talk about a handful of these micronutrients, the ones that I feel there is solid scientific evidence to support a role for them in the immune system. And those are, so in the category of vitamins, I picked these four. Vitamin A, very solid evidence that it's really essential for host defense, especially at the mucosal surfaces, so at the skin and in the gut. Vitamin A is really important. And we know a lot of this data actually from, unfortunately, doing studies on malnutrition in third world countries where we know there's a strong deficiency in a lot of these vitamins. Vitamin C, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it and probably taken quite a bit of it over the winter. It's an antioxidant, really important for phagocytic activity of neutrophils and monocytes, again, for that reason that I mentioned, because they use reactive oxygen species to kill the microbes. But it also can enhance T cell responses. Vitamin D is also important at the mucosal surface where it stimulates the production of antimicrobial peptides. So these are things that our skin cells can make, as well as our intestinal epithelial cells or our respiratory epithelial cells can make. These are small peptides that we know can attack bacteria and viruses and help control infection. And it's also important for the differentiation of monocytes, so those phagocytic cells. And then finally, vitamin E, it's lipid-soluble, antioxidant, also very essential for well-function of T cells and has anti-inflammatory properties. For the most part, we don't face any deficiencies in these micronutrients. The only time we see this is during malnutrition, so primarily in third world countries. But the other important segment of the population where we might see these deficiencies are actually the elderly. And a lot of the studies that support the role of these vitamins in immunity come from either studying malnourished children in third world countries or studying the elderly. So a lot of the solid data on the role of vitamin E, vitamin D, etc., comes from the fact that we know that supplementing older people with these vitamins can help them respond well to influenza, respond to the vaccine better, etc. So where do they come from? Everything that you can find at your grocery store, in the vegetable aisle in the cold room. I just like putting these pictures in because it just reminds us that these nutrients are at our fingertips at most of our grocery stores. And then the other things that I wanted to cover was the trace elements. And these are zinc, copper, iron, and selenium. And they're all very important for development of lymphocytes, especially T cells. Several of them can act as antioxidant, again, very important for that phagocytic activity of cells. A lot of them help T cells proliferate, help make more neutrophils, especially for copper. And selenium is a great antiviral factor it really enhances those lymphocyte function. And again, where do we find these? A lot of things that are very accessible, should be accessible to us in a grocery store. And I would be remiss if I did not touch upon the microbiome in this lecture. I don't think we can actually have a lecture on nutrition without talking about the microbiome. I think many of you know now that we coexist with a large number of microbes in our body. There's actually 10-fold more microbes in us than actually cells of human origin. And they make about 10-fold more genes. Actually, I saw this really great cartoon recently with lots of bacteria holding a little sign saying, "We are the 99%." And I thought that was awesome. So they really are, 99% of us is things of microbial origin. And they're mostly bacteria, but they're also viruses and fungi as well. And they're everywhere. So I listed here, they're on the skin, they're in the lung, they're in the GI tract, but really most of them are actually in the GI tract, in the gastrointestinal tract. And as you can see, there is a gradient where we have the most amount of these, what we call commensal bacteria or commensal viruses and fungi. This microbiome is really in the colon. And they're really important. We know that they play a protective role. They actually, in the gut especially, they help control these epithelial cells. So they have them proliferate just the right amount. They also induce what we call tight junction proteins, and these are little proteins that actually help the epithelial cells mesh together. So these are the first physical barrier that prevents microbes from crossing over to get into our respiratory system or our gut. So the tighter those epithelial, those tight junctions, the better it is. They also induce or make our immune cells make immunoglobulin A. Immunoglobulin A is great antibodies. They're broad acting and they're at the mucosal surface. So again, just layering on preventive action from bad microbes from getting into the body. They also induce the production of antimicrobial peptides, low levels of them, by our epithelial cells. So again, acting as a repellent for bad bacteria and bad viruses. And they also compete for space with bad bacteria. So when you have your commensal bacteria and your microbiome is really nice and healthy, other bacteria will have a hard time coming in and kind of pushing their way into it because your commensals are already occupying that space. Remember, they're the 99%. And they also educate our immune system. So we know from experimental studies that if we rear mice, if we actually breed mice in what we call germ-free conditions, and this is possible in the laboratory. We can actually grow mice in a completely sterile environment. So they come into this world and they are never exposed to microbes. They have none of these commensals. They cannot respond well to viral infections. They cannot do many things that our immune system of another mouse reared under normal conventional housing can do. So they play a really important role in educating our immune system, telling it what's normal, what to react to, what's not to react to. And so commonly it's believed that, I'm sure you all have heard about the hygiene hypothesis, that the fact that we're overusing antibiotics, we're keeping our kids a lot cleaner, we're not letting them play in sandboxes quite as much, is that the root cause, or is believed to be part of the root cause for why we see a lot more autoimmune diseases, a lot more allergies, and a lot more other immune-mediated diseases, because we're not actually giving the immune system of our children a chance to understand how to react to things in measured ways. We're keeping them too clean, so they overreact to everything. And also from a metabolic standpoint, our microbiome is really important for helping us synthesize certain vitamins, fermenting non-digestible products, metabolism of dietary carcinogens and things that are bad for us, and also energy salvage. So they're very important. And our microbiome is heavily influenced by so many things. So actually the birth, so what kind of, do you have a vaginal birth or a C-section birth, actually affects what kind of microbiome you end up with. Breastfeeding or not breastfeeding controls the microbiome. The size of the family controls the microbiome. Access to good water and hygienic environment. Use of antibiotics and other medications. Type of food that we eat, the pollutants that we're exposed to. All of these factors affect our microbiome, which in turn will affect the development of our immune system and our ability to respond appropriately to infection and not respond to things like pollen and other allergens in our body. And in turn, so all these factors influence our microbiome, and then our microbiome influences other things in return. So we know that dysregulation in the microbiome, at least we don't necessarily always know that it's the cause, but it's definitely associated with a lot of different diseases. And in some animal models, in the mouse model, we've actually been able to take the microbiome of, for example, a mouse with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, put it into another mouse that was never on a high-fat diet, never saw this, and actually reproduce the same disease in this mouse by just transferring the bacteria from one gut into the next. And so you probably are hearing in the news that we're looking at fecal transplants as one of the ways to also just readjust the microbiome of people who have gone, this is more for people who, for example, have really horrible infections with C. difficile, for example. It's a horrible bacteria that takes over your GI tract and just causes malabsorption and horrible, horrible things. And we can't control it with antibiotics that well. So we're actually looking at things like, can we take the microbiome of a healthy person and fix this, fix these types of diseases with it? And so probiotics, right? I mean, you go to the store, you're bombarded with all these ads, like get 23 billion organisms. Like, yeah. Well, okay, so let's first do some vocabulary. What are probiotics? They are the live bacteria and yeast that are good for us, that can promote health. Prebiotics are just as important, and they're actually the food that the probiotics need to survive. And there's a lot of products out there already that have a good amount of pre and probiotics at the same time, like yogurt. And really, in terms of experimental evidence, we know that probiotics are really important for treating diarrhea, especially after somebody has had an antibiotics course. And I mean, I remember hearing this as a kid when I would go on antibiotics, that you have to eat your yogurt. And it's true, you do. But other things we're still playing with. So they may have a role in some inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel disease, but none of that has been really well supported by data. But it's important to remember that if you already have a healthy microbiome, adding more to it is not really going to work. There's, first of all, no room for the additional probiotics you're buying to actually, remember, 99% are already occupying the space. There's no room for them to go in there and get more space. And so I guess my take-home message is everything in moderation and with good reason. And so just to wrap up, so we can leave some time for questions, I hope that I've convinced you that adequate nutrition is really critical for maintaining a healthy immune system, and that I've been able to show you that nutrient excess and deficiency can both harm the immune system, that nutrient excess during pregnancy can have far-reaching ramification on the offspring, that alcohol excess harms the immune system, but one glass of wine a day might not be such a bad idea if you're over 21. Okay, just make sure. That micronutrients are also important for normal functioning of the immune system, and that a healthy microbiome is essential. But at the end of it, I just want to leave you with this. There is wonderful resources to go to, such as the USDA guide. And this is from 2010, and they're actually just about to release the 2015. They only come out with these every 5 years. But it's a wonderful resource in terms of what's good for you to eat, and just kind of, these are my favorite 2 chapters. What to avoid and what to eat more of. It's really simple. And I think I just want to leave you with the thought that, I think we live in a society where there's a lot of pushing of micronutrients and vitamins and go get this and buy this other thing. And at the end of the day, this is what you want your plates to look like. And if you do this, and if you don't have any other problems, you should be okay. You should have a well-functioning immune system. And with that, I'll end, and I'll take any questions you may have.
Well, that was really very interesting. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask, we'd like you to please raise your hand, and one of our science ambassadors will bring you a microphone. And then you can ask your question and then return the microphone. I'm going to ask Dr. Messaoudi Powers to please restate the question because the session's being video recorded. So we'll open the floor to questions.
Hi, that was great. So I've got a question about the maternal obesity, which I found very exciting research. As I was watching what you were presenting, it occurred to me that incidence of autism has been shown to correlate with everything from GMOs to the increase in organically grown crops. I wondered if anybody thought of addressing incidence of autism versus the increase in obesity.
So the question is, I'm going to do the Reader's Digest version of it. Is there any data that would support a role for maternal obesity during pregnancy and the link to increased rates of autism? And that's a really great question. So I can tell you that there is no solid links that I have seen in the literature between the increase in obesity in pregnant women and the rates of autism. I think the increase that we're seeing are due to a few things. One of them is we're better at diagnosing, and we're watching for symptoms a lot more than we did 50 years ago. But there is actually exciting research that's coming out that's linking microbiome changes to autism. And the microbiome of children with autism spectrum disorders completely different from age-matched children. And it's unclear at this point if it's because they start off with a different microbiome, and we know that some of the microbiome is actually transgenerationally inherited. So what I was mentioning, C-section versus live birth is really important. That's the first instance a baby actually acquires a microbiome, is actually going through the birth canal. And so there is some acquisition, and we know that microbiomes are passed transgenerationally, so who knows what the impact of that is. But the other question is, well, are autistic children eating slightly differently, and that's why they have a different microbiome? What's the cause and what's the consequence? And that's actually being addressed in mouse models because we can grow them in germ-free, and then we also have mouse models of autism, and we can do these transfers and look at the role of microbiome. Thank you for that question.
What do you think of vitamin pills and supplements for the elderly and that type of thing? I know the usual response is to eat, but not everyone likes vegetables.
Yeah. So the question is, what about supplementation for the elderly? And that's a really good question because in the elderly, it's not just about your diet. There's so many changes in the gut that actually affect absorption of micronutrients in the elderly. And we do see deficiencies of a lot of the vitamins that I actually was listing and the minerals, the trace elements that I was listing in the elderly. And there is very solid evidence for supplementation with vitamin E, with vitamin A, with selenium during flu season as having a very significant impact on influenza vaccine responses and incidence and duration and severity of symptoms during the cold season. So I would say that is something that is definitely worth discussing. We have a couple here. Sorry.
I'm not sure if you went over this, but what is it that causes the baby to have a bad immune system? Is it that the baby has the same immune system as the mom when it's in its embryo stage?
So the question is, why do babies born to obese mom have a different immune system? Why is it compromised? And that's a really good question, and we don't know the answer to that yet, but we have a hypothesis. So I was mentioning that micronutrients can act as epigenetic factors, and I mentioned that epigenetic factors are things that go modify our DNA, and the consequences of that is a change in the gene expression. What genes do we express and when and how much? And we strongly believe that it's the nutritional intake that might be acting as epigenetic factors as the baby is actually, as is maturing and growing. So we're modifying some of the gene expression profiles in the offspring. And there is lots of evidence to support that, actually. So for not in the immune system, but in terms of obesity, we know children born to obese moms tend to become obese themselves, regardless of the diet that they go on. And there are data that have supported changes in the genes that control energy expenditure that make them basically store more fat and expend less energy. And that's inherited transgenerationally. So that is our hypothesis, but we don't know yet. Kind of, loosely. Sorry. One in the back, and then Iqbal. Go ahead, sorry.
I'm interested in whether there has been a connection between stress and immune deficiency, because I've heard some hypotheses, but I'm wondering.
Yeah, so the question is there a link between stress and the immune system? Yeah, and there is definitely a very strong connection between stress and the immune system, and it's more than a hypothesis. So we know, for example, that the increase in cortisols can affect transcription of immune-related genes, and people who are under a lot of stress will also have reactivation of viruses like varicella zoster virus or HSV1, and we know that that's actually due to immunosuppression. So stress has a huge effect on the immune system. Yeah, try to stay away from stress if you can. And Iqbal.
I have two questions. What is your personal diet like? And then my second question is, everything in chocolate-free, tastes wonderful. So what's the scientific explanation for that?
Oh, those are really good questions, Iqbal. So my personal diet, I don't know if I really want to share this. I do shop at Sprouts a lot. I just took the dining survey at UCR dining survey, so I can say this. I hardly ever eat out, really. I prefer to cook my own foods, and I know what's in it. I don't necessarily go crazy buying organic food or things like that, or non-GMO. I actually don't really pay a lot of attention to that. My goal in life is to have as colorful of a plate as I possibly can. So the more colorful your plate is, I think the healthier it is. That's my hypothesis. The food, the tasting, yes, I know, right? So we actually have a wonderful scientist in our Biomedical Sciences division. His name is Nick DiPatricio, and he actually studies the interaction between the gut and the brain. And he's been able to show in his rat model that fatty foods and fats in general, specific fats, I really don't want to butcher his research, so you should definitely talk to him. But there are specific fats that just really engage our appetite centers in a way that is unhealthy. You really can't have one potato chip. It's true. Just like your brain is wired to respond to those fatty foods. And I think the hypothesis is that dates back from the time when food was really scarce. And so when we came upon food that was rich in fats, we really wanted to eat as much of it as possible because you didn't know when the next time you were going to run across food like that again was. But fast forward a few thousand years, we're still in that mode, but now you could just go to Jack in the Box, and unfortunately, one too many times. But yeah, I would encourage you to talk to Nick. He's got some really interesting results. The rats can gain weight, even if he has a shunt that has the oils just literally leak out. So they're not even being digested, but just the sensation of eating it, So it's really fascinating research. Sorry.
What's your opinion of the current interest in gluten-free diet?
Yeah, the question is, what's the interest in gluten-free diets? And if you have celiac disease or a gluten allergy, it's a serious disease, and it should be addressed with gluten-free foods and changes in diet. But the rest of us who don't have celiac disease, I don't really think we should run around eating gluten-free. I think it's a fad. It's just one of those things. But if you have celiac disease, and it could develop at any age, if there's any suspicion of that, then absolutely should go see your doctor and get tested for it, because it's a really serious disease. You could probably just shout it. I'll repeat the question.
I'm a pretty strict vegetarian. No eggs, meat, fish even.
I know I get this question a lot is, what do I eat to get protein?
Mhm.
And I just kind of eat what I like to eat.
So the question is, if you're vegetarian, how do you maintain an adequate nutritional intake? There's actually a lot of protein in other sources, like beans. Beans are a great source of protein. And this USDA guide is fantastic for finding nutritional value in a lot of different food groups. It's really not that long to read. It's free. It's free on the USDA's website. Highly recommend it. But there's a lot of protein. I mean, there's entire cultures around the world that are vegan and vegetarian, and they do really well by just making sure that you balance this out with other sources like nuts and beans. Lentils are a great source of protein. Yeah.
That comes from www.health.gov.
Right, and it's actually published by the USDA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And they should be coming out with the 2015 one anytime now. They actually just closed the public comment session of it, so it should be sometime in the next couple of months. You should see it.
Just to follow up on what you were saying, if you read the China study, you'll see that you really don't need 35% protein in your diet, that 5 to 10% does you just fine. So for those folks that ask vegans how they get their protein, there is a lot of material online that can explain that very nicely. The China study is an excellent thing to read too.
Great. Yeah, so you should definitely talk to the lady in the back. She's got some resources too. Thanks. Okay.
I'll speak loudly. You talked about children from pregnant or from obese pregnant women. Maybe their immune systems are not sophisticated or mature enough to accept vaccinations. So do you feel that the vaccination schedule for children might be modified?
So the question is, I put out data that shows that the immune system of babies born to obese moms may be compromised in their ability to respond to antigens. And so the question is, should we be modifying our vaccine schedule? And that is really that's one of the questions that we really want to pursue. So based on our data, we would predict and we would hypothesize that these children might not respond well to vaccination. And we want to do that. We're starting actually enrollment of a bigger cohort with follow-up of the kids now for the first and second year of life, where we're going to get small amounts of blood to look at titers to antibodies, so for the common vaccinations that they get. And my guess would be that we might, for these kids, have to double the dose, like we do for the elderly. So we have a super flu vaccine for the elderly because they don't respond quite as well to the standard dose that we use in adults. So we might be in a situation like that, or we might have to use new adjuvants. So we need to know exactly when those defects are kicking in and how big is this defect before we can start asking questions like that. But yes, you're absolutely correct.
So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to cut off the questions. You can maybe stay for a little bit if people didn't get a chance to answer their question, to have their question answered. Please join with me in thanking Dr. Messaoudi Powers for a wonderful lecture. I would like to thank all of you for coming. We would really appreciate your help in planning for next year's science lecture series by completing the survey that you got when you entered. After you have filled out the survey, please drop the form in the box that's just out on the table outside, or give it to one of our science ambassadors. And we hope to see you again at next year's science lecture series. Thank you very much.